Welcome to the Daily Dose. My name is JD. I'm one of the pastors here at the Vista campus. I got an object lesson for you today. Sometimes a small thing can make a big point. This is a penny. Did you know an average worker in a full day here in California at minimum wage would make 9,600 pennies on average? That's about 20 a minute. Back in the day, in Jesus' day, the smallest coin was this right here. It was a mite. This mite was, you'd make maybe 160 of them in a day, meaning in a minute, you'd make about a third of a mite. It ain't worth very much. I show you that because Jesus used that same mite in a great story. In Luke chapter 21, he said he looked up at the temple and he saw the rich people putting their gifts in the temple treasury, and he saw a poor widow that had 2 of these copper coins, these mites. And he made this point. He said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these other people put in gifts out of their wealth. But this widow, she put in out of her poverty. She gave all she had to live on. She got celebrated. She was an amazing object lesson. What do we know about her? We know she was the poorest of the poor. She couldn't go to the men's courts and worship. We know that she was a widow, so she'd lost her husband. She likely was a woman of faith because she was making an offering. She likely had prayed for her husband, and likely those prayers weren't answered. He was gone. And here she shows up with 2 mites, 2 little mites, 6 minutes worth of work. And she puts him in the plate, and Jesus said, that is sacrificial generosity. She gave everything she had to live on. Well, here you are traveling through Philippians, and we're in chapter 4 toward the end of the book. And Paul makes a significant point about this church in Philippi when he said, it was good of you, Philippians, to share with me, Paul, in my troubles. When I set out for Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving except you guys. You sent me aid more than once when I was in need. And these gifts you just sent me, well, they're a fragrant offering. They're an acceptable sacrifice. Your gifts, Philippians, they're pleasing to God. What do we know about the Philippians? We know that they gave. We know that they gave on multiple occasions, and we know those gifts helped Paul. But how were they like the widow? You got to go back to 2 Corinthians 8 to see that, where Paul once again writes about the Philippians, and he says, in the midst of a severe trial, the Philippians' overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. You've got poverty and joy welling up into generosity. How in the world does that work? I would think a widow that lost her husband would come with her last 2 coins and she'd clutch them in a clenched fist because I'm angry with you, God. You didn't answer my prayers. I'm hanging on to every last penny I have. And yet, no, her hand was loose. She gave all that she had. The Philippians, similarly, were a poor church. They were getting taxed to death by the Romans. They didn't have much, and yet Paul acknowledges their generosity in the midst of their poverty, and he says, this was sacrificial. This is worthy of celebrating. In fact, he would go on to say, the Philippians urged Paul, let us give to you. Our heart is so inclined toward you. Please, Paul, let us help. Oh, those kind of gifts matter. They matter to Paul. They matter to God. They matter to Jesus. But how do we do it? How do I come to the places where I have an opportunity to give and be sacrificial? And how do I give with a loose hand, like the Philippians or like the widow? I think Paul answers that question in part when he writes this in 2 Corinthians 8, verse 5. He said, they, referring to the Philippians, they gave first of all to the Lord. They gave themselves to the Lord first, and then they gave their offering to Paul. Everything I have, everything you have, has only been given to me on loan. I'm a steward. It belongs to the King. It belongs to God in the first place. And if I can approach my life with that knowledge intact, that everything I have belongs to Him anyway, I'm much more likely to have a loose hand and say, this is yours to begin with. You direct how I give it and how I use it. So church, on this day, would you approach your life with an open hand.